Well, good evening, everyone. It's Rabbi Noah Farkas from Valley Best Shalom. Welcome to our Tuesday evening learning of Pirke Avot, Ethics of the Fathers, or Ethics of the Sages, which I entitle Ancient Ethics for Modern Times. I have a nice class here on Zoom with us, but also I'll be teaching the text. And so I just want to welcome everyone. And if you are joining us online, feel free to make comments. And if you need the link to the Zoom, I'm sure we can provide it. So just want to make sure that everyone out there is staying safe and staying healthy, and that they're doing their best to get through not only this pandemic but this very difficult moment, especially because there were some marches and protests in the valley today, and they have been, I think, overall very peaceful and very calm. In fact, I was attending one of them, and a squad car came by, and the cops got out and waved to everyone and were honking just like anyone else who was supporting the protest, which was very heartening for the protesters to see. So I just hope overall, though, folks are staying well and are doing their best to stay healthy and to support our community in whichever way you feel fit in this very difficult time. And for all of you who are joining us for the Zoom, it's always nice to see you. I hope you had a wonderful day. We're going to begin our class. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here so that we can all get a nice chance to learn together. Okay. Can you guys tell me, just give me a thumbs up or something if you can see it, because I just want to make sure that, we had that problem that one time or two. So, okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so tonight's class is on the fifth Mishnah of the first chapter. And it is, I call it open and closed, how to deal with hard texts. There are texts in our tradition that feel very comfortable and honest and glorious to us, and there are texts in our tradition that want to make us cry. And this text is both. It's rare that you find a text that is both in one short paragraph. And so I call it open and closed because of the metaphors used in this Mishnah. And we're going to talk a little bit about how to deal with powerful texts and how to deal with enervating texts that feel like they take power away. So I'm going to begin by reading the text, and we're going to talk about it. And we're not going to shy away from talking about hard things. So this is the fifth Mishnah in the first chapter. And if you remember, for the first many Mishnayot, each author of the Mishnah is a student of the previous author. So chapter number 5 is the student of number 4. Number 4 is the student number 3, etc. So now we're in number 5, and we have Yossi ben Yochanan. So Yossi, son of Yochanan. Okay, and it says Ish Yerushalayim. He was a man who came from Jerusalem. Omer. Yehi veitecha patuch l'revacha v'yihu oniim b'nei beitecha v'al tarbeh sicha im ha'isha v'ishto amru kol v'chomer be'eshet chaviro. Vikan amru chachamim kol zman she'adam arbeh sicha im ha'isha gorim ra'a la'atzmo uvotel midvrei Torah v'sofor yiresh gehinnom. So let's get into it. Yossi ben Yochanan, a man of Jerusalem, used to say, "Let thy house be wide open, and let the poor be members of your household." And then he goes on to say, "Engage not too much in conversation with women." They said this with regard to one's wife, and all the more so this rule applies to another person's wife. And then from here, the sage says, as long as a man engages in too much conversation with women, he causes evil to himself, neglects the study of Torah, and in the end, he will inherit Gehinnom, which is our version of hell. So let's be clear that the first clause sounds really great, and the last 3 clauses sound absolutely terrible. And there's no way of getting around that, and we're going to talk a little bit about why they focused on the last 3 clauses. What I want to do first, though, is to focus on this first clause, and about 15 minutes from now, we'll shift over and talk about the really hard stuff. Okay, that's my plan for tonight. So Yossi ben Yochanan, a son of Jerusalem, used to say, "Let your house be wide and open, and let the poor be members of your household." And this is interesting because if you look at the previous Mishnah, for those who remember last week, it was talking about creating your house as a place where scholars come and that you come and learn at their feet, literally basking in the dust of their feet. So there's a literary chain between the last Mishnah and this one, in the sense that we shifted from talking about global things to talking about how you build your house. And in the past Mishnah, it said your house should be a place where scholars come and discuss things, and you should scoop up their words and engage in them. So then in this one, the extension of this is that your house should be patuach l'revacha. So those words are really interesting. The word patuach in Hebrew means open, completely open, and revacha means wide, open wide. In fact, the land of Israel in the Tanakh is usually referred to as Eretz Chemda Torva Urchava, a good, bountiful land that is wide open, Urchava. And the word Urchava, which is where the word Revacha comes from, is the antithesis, the antonym for that word is Yetzer or Mitzer, which means the narrows. And the word Mitzrayim, which is the word for Egypt, is considered to be the narrow place. So if you were to look at these as a paradigm of thought, the antonyms are Egypt and Israel, Mitzrayim and Yisrael, but also Mitzrayim and Orchava or Rivacha, which means Mitzrayim being the place of constriction and of narrowness, and Israel being the place of wide open freedom. Okay, so those words are chosen very particularly, that your house has to be Patuach l'Rivacha, completely wide open. And who are the people that they're thinking of in that moment? The poor. Let the poor, it says, Vayihini b'nei beitecha, become children of your house. Okay, so that is perhaps the most universalistic statement in the Mishnah today. That a Jew, is a sage, is not only supposed to be tied into our history and tied into our Torah and tied into the rituals of Judaism, and to make our houses into places that we learn from each other and learn from masters, rabbis. But your house is also supposed to be open wide, completely open to anyone who wants to pass through. And, we can talk about this moment that we're in, but before we do that, I want to just go through a couple of the comments on what it means to have an open house. So here is our good friend Bartonora, who is the Italian commentator on Pirke Avot, and he says, he says, make your home open wide, like the home of Avraham, our father, may peace be upon him, which was open to the world's four directions, so that guests would not need to go around to find an entrance. That is to say that, if you can imagine, Abraham's tent in the mind of the commentator was a canopy like this, and at least during the day or what have you, it was completely open so that anyone coming could be seen and was welcomed into the home. In Jewish tradition, we have a home like this. We build a home like this for a wedding couple. It's called a chuppah, where you have 4 poles and a talit on it, and it is said to be a quintessential Jewish home modeled on the tent of Abraham and Sarah. And that for that moment, the bride and the groom, or the partners together, are thought of being likened to the first Jews, because they have their home open. That the home that we want this young couple to have and to cherish would embody the values of Abraham and Sarah. So let's take a look at the chapter in Breshit, the chapter in Genesis, where we learn about Abraham and Sarah and about how open their house is. So here it says, the Lord appeared to Abraham, by the terebinths of Mamre, and he was sitting at the entrance of the tent as the day grew hot. Okay, so here again, he's sitting in Mamre, which is in a warm area in the land of Israel, and God appeared to him as the day grew hot, sometime in the middle of the day. Looking up, he saw 3 men standing near him, and as soon as he saw them, he ran from the entrance of the tent to greet them, bowing to the ground. He said, my lords, if it please you, do not go on past your servant. Let a little water be brought, bathe your feet, and recline under the tree. And let me fetch a morsel of bread that you may refresh yourselves and then go on. And seeing that you have come your servant's way. They replied, do as you have said. Abraham hastened into the tent and Sarah and said, quick, 3 seahs of choice flour. Knead and make cakes. Then Abraham ran to the herd, took a calf, tender and choice, and gave it to a servant boy who prepared it. He took curds and the milk and the calf and had prepared and set them before them, and he waited on them under the tree as they ate. So, for those of you who know the Bible a little bit, you know that this happened the night or a few days after Abraham circumcised himself. So, the idea, there are so many Jewish hospitality ideas that come out of this one text. The number one is that we imagine God or these angels visiting Abraham as he's recovering from a major operation. So, the idea that we visit the sick is tied to this story. Okay, that we try to be like God, and just as God visits the sick, so too you should visit the sick, and we learn that from this story. And so one of the wonderful mitzvot of visiting the sick we find in this story. The second one that we find in this story is the idea of hachnasat orchim, that you are supposed to be very hospitable. I mean, especially thinking about Abraham, sort of healing from his circumcision, going out, greeting these folks, so just as the kindness that is paid to Abraham by God, so too that kindness is paid by Abraham to God in reverse. Okay, so just as God paid Abraham in loving kindness, so too did Abraham pay heed to his guests. The third is that you realize that men don't do anything. They just sit and welcome guests, and the wife has to make food, and the husband gets to hang out, and the servant boy has to slaughter the lamb and prepare it all. And the fourth thing you learn about this is that kashrut is a later development in culture, because there's no way that he can make curds and milk and then serve goat or lamb in the same meal. Just not possible if you're living a fully kosher life. The rabbis like to play around with this and say that, they ate the milk and the curds first, and then they waited a little while, and then they had meat, but just taking on the on the sense of this. So you learn 2 really positive mitzvot, and you learn two kind of anachronistic things. But the point of this is that Abraham's tent was open, and that it was considered to be utterly hospitable. But it doesn't say anything about the poor. Right? It talks about, sure, that makes sense if you knew the angels were coming, or you knew that maybe 3 finely dressed visitors were coming. You might go out and bake choice flour. You might go out and make a feast. If your boss was coming to dinner, and you knew your boss was coming to dinner, you'd probably vacuum the floor, and you'd probably make something nice to eat, because you want to make sure that you look good for the boss, right? Well, the book of Deuteronomy extends this idea, and this is where I think that it becomes really important. So, when it says in the book of Deuteronomy, for the Lord your God is God supreme, and the Lord is supreme, the great, the mighty and awesome God, who shows no favor and takes no bribe, but upholds the cause of the fatherless, the widow, and befriends the stranger, providing him with food and clothing. You too must befriend the stranger, for you are strangers in the land of Egypt. So Abraham never experienced Egypt, so maybe he didn't get that memo. But here we see God actually acting like Abraham in the book of Deuteronomy. God befriends the stranger, providing the stranger with food and clothing. And this way, actually, God imitates man, or God imitates humanity. And then therefore, we must imitate God, who imitated humanity. You too must befriend the stranger, because we knew what it was like to be strangers in the land of Egypt. So here we have 2 senses of ethics. We have Abraham's actions, which, using my argument, inspired God's actions, which then in turn inspired human beings' actions of a later generation. So that circle, I think, is really what creates a lot of power about the Jewish understanding of taking care of strangers. Not just the strangers who we don't know, but specifically the orphans. And being an orphan is a class unto itself. You don't have a lot of hope. You can't necessarily take care of yourself. And so we actually use the idea of the orphan, the widow, the stranger as a category for people who have been othered or live at the marginalized part of society. And that is who we are as Jews. And that's why I think the first statement is about being wide open. That as Jews, we have to be wide open. And we have to, and according to these ethics, we have to understand that even though we come from a particular place with a particular history and a particular relationship to a particular place like Israel, even though we come from all of those things, the outcome of those things are not just to help ourselves, but to help the world. And we find that when we're called the light into the nations or become a nation of priests. We find that again when we have the Haggadah and the stories of remembering that we were slaves in Egypt, and therefore that chain of pain has to stop with us and we have to open ourselves to other people. We find that again throughout history where Jews have put themselves on the line to help the countries that they lived in, even though those countries treated them terribly, or that we've always helped the non-Jewish poor along with the Jewish poor. That the oldest charity in the city in which we live, Los Angeles, is a Hebrew charity that became the Jewish Family Service, whose mission isn't just to help the Jewish poor, but to help all the poor. That has been part of who we are, but we have a wide open tent. And so I think about this moment, and we have to talk about this moment, the moment that we're in right now, a moment of pandemic, and a moment where the structural racism in this country has boiled over, and the brutality against people of color for over 240 years in this country has come to a head again. That it's in this moment that if you use this ethic and you use this mission, understand that we have to be open. That we can't open our building, right? We have to open our hearts. And then we have to listen. And we have to understand that we too had a fight once on our hands for our own freedom. And we should hear the echoes of our freedom and our freedom songs in the songs of people who are experiencing that brutality today. My heart goes out to every single one of those protesters. And all the more so Jews of color, who are African American, Jews who trace their lineage to non-Caucasian countries, who both sit at the intersection of both racism and anti-Semitism. And so all the more so we should be helping from our tradition and going out into the world, which is the Jewish position. We don't have to give up on our rights, our freedoms. We don't have to give up on our sensibilities, our religious practices, but we use our religious practices to be open to the world. That is the beginning of this Mishnah. And if that was the end of this Mishnah, it would be a wonderful class and we can call it a night. And we feel like we lived up to Valley Beth Shalom's legacy and Rabbi Shulweiss's legacy. Unfortunately, that's not the end of this Mishnah. So before I move on, are there any specific questions or comments from the folks in the Zoom so that I know I'm on the right track before we get to the hard stuff? Yeah, Arnie, I see you. You got to unmute yourself, please.
I did see in the Mishnah that it does make a difference between helping a poor person who's Jewish and one who is not, even though they both are in your household, let's say.
Yeah, in the Mishnah in general, and now we're talking about not this specific Mishnah, but the Mishnah of Gittin, which is, I didn't bring that Mishnah. There's what is the order in which, what happens if you only have $50, or let's make it easy. Let's say you have $10 and you have 20 people who need help. Who do you give the money to first, right? And we know that there are circles of obligation. If it was your son who came to you and, he has been a respectful and wonderful relationship, you'd probably give him all $10 if you could. If it was your son's friend, maybe you'd help him out too because you have a relationship. What about someone on the other side of the world, right? So the questions of those circles, and actually in Masechet Arachin, which is a Masechet in the Talmud, it actually talks about kind of those circles. And it's hard to know which circle you're at and when. So it is very hard when you have limited resources. God willing, we do actually live in a world where there's unlimited resources. I just wish that we could allocate them across this.
I raised the question, Rabbi, because in the presence of this pandemic, there are facilities, health facilities, that in the presence of a surge, decisions have to be made prioritizing resources. That's why I raised it when I read this in this Mishnah.
I'm so glad you raised that, because what is today, Tuesday? So on Thursday morning, my op-ed co-written with Dr. Neil Wenger is coming out about medical triage, and in the Jewish Journal. And we talk specifically about how do you decide who gets those in during a surge, who would get treatment. And we don't come down on a specific policy, because that wasn't the purpose of the op-ed, but an encouragement that medical organizations have to establish these rules when there is no surge, so that they can, right? So, and there's a number of ways of doing that. Neil and I went around and around and around talking about all the different ways in Jewish life that's discussed, and in his world, because he's a premier medical ethicist, about how he discusses it. And if you want to jump in on that conversation, Arnie, all you need to do is go to medical school, and you can be part of my doctors group, where we discuss these on a regular basis. Yeah, so that's where I'm coming from on that. So that leads us to now we got to jump into the hard stuff, stuff that makes you want to cry a little bit when it comes from your own tradition. I'm going to read it, just part of it, one more time, so we're all brought up to speed. So if the first line of the Mishnah feels very open, the last three lines feel very closed, very, very closed. And that it can come from the same person complicates our view of any one of these rabbis. But it's kind of true for all of us, that all of us have bright, brilliant sides, and all of us have sides that other people don't like, or that we don't like about ourselves. So he says, in addition to opening up your tent very wide, he says, you should alter betzicha im ashisha. Don't engage in too much conversation with women. And they said this with regard to one's own wife. How much more so does the rule apply to regard to another man's wife? From here, the sages said, as long as a man engages in too much conversation with women, he causes evil to himself, he neglects the study of Torah, and in the end, he will inherit hell, or Gehenna. I want to bring one text which just makes it totally clear what they're talking about, because if we don't name it, then I feel like we're actually not talking about it clearly. So Rambam, the Maimonides, wrote his commentary, one of his first books on Pirke Avot, commentary on Pirke Avot, and he makes it, I think, crystal clear. He says, Be'ishto amru. He says, they said, so stated with his wife. It's known that the majority of talk with women is about matters of sex. And because of this, he said that increasing conversation with them is forbidden, since he causes evil to himself, meaning an abundance of desire. So I'm just reading this is the shortest version of naming misogyny that I found on this commentary, and it's worth bringing just to name it what it is. Men who wrote the Mishnah, who were only allowed to study Torah in a single-sex environment, only saw women through the lens of sex. And to them, sex was bad. Okay, now it was pleasure, it has pleasure, but sex was something that was supposed to be for procreation, and it can share in love, but not in a modern sense of love. So when you talk with a woman, you're only going to be talking about sex, and if you're talking about sex, you're not talking about the Torah. They couldn't imagine a world where women would talk about anything else, except for maybe, household mundane things, mendacity. Okay, it's the male gaze. Now, in some other parts of text that try to complicate this a little bit more, they say that women are the ones who goad their husbands and asking them, how come they don't make enough money? How come you're letting this other guy walk all over you, right? And they never want women to remind men of their own insecurities, fallibilities, etc. But all of that in my mind just goes back to sex. It goes back to the dominant relationship between a man and woman in primeval times around sex. So that's why I brought this text, because a woman goading a man and a man being upset at his wife is really saying that you shouldn't be upsetting my ego, which has everything to do with sex, in my opinion. That might be my post-Freudian analysis. So let's just name what it is. You're not allowed to talk to a woman All the more so another man's wife, because you're going to talk to another man's wife. You're going to be talking about sex, in which case you'll be possibly transgressing 2 of the 10 commandments, coveting another man's wife, and then maybe even sleeping with another man's wife, right? So that, you can't do that. And what happens if you are in that mind frame all the time? You won't study Torah, you'll go to hell, bad things will come over you, right? So that's where that's all coming from. It all goes back. I think Rambam is exactly right. You'll have an abundance of desire, and that abundance of desire will lead you down a bad path. So I just think it's important to name it, even though I don't really wanted to talk about it too much, but let's just name it for what it is. So then Rabbi Gordon Tucker, who was one of my teachers, and if you are in my Lunch and Learn group, have had him as a teacher with you before. He wrote a commentary on Pirke Avot, just recently published, maybe 6 months ago. Maybe it's a year ago now. And this is what he wrote on this Mishnah. I think it's important to mention. He says, the third part of the Mishnah presents us with a manifestly misogynistic point of view, which would not have been out of sync with the major currents in the Hellenistic world. It is worth noting that in the text before us, what follows the initial advice to avoid speaking to women too much is clearly a gloss added by Rabbi Yossi's teaching, and its presence suggests that his exhortation was deemed important enough to somebody to have merited further elaboration. Yossi's original statement might well have been intended to mean that one should avoid conversations, which might after all become more intimate, with women other than one's wife. And that would be most a reasonable piece of advice aimed at avoiding unnecessary temptation. But the gloss makes it clear that it is the intrinsic nature of conversation with women that was understood to be objectionable and dangerous to one's well-being, even with one's wife. There is little to be done to redeem this teaching for contemporary readers, other than to look beyond the gloss and to likely original intent by Rabbi Yossi ben Yochanan. Of course, my opinion is that I slightly disagree with Rabbi Tucker. I think that even his original intent, if Rabbi Yossi ben Yochanan wanted to say, don't engage in mundane conversations, he should have written, don't engage in mundane conversations. In a modern context, if that was true, right, because you don't want to be tempted, then you shouldn't engage in conversations about politics. You shouldn't certainly engage in conversations about sports. You shouldn't engage in conversations about movies. You shouldn't engage in conversations that don't have deep meaning to them. And for those of us who are already introverted, that's very helpful, because then I don't have to worry about what to say at cocktail parties. But for the rest of you, if that's what Rabbi Yossi ben Yochanan really meant, he should have said that. And he shouldn't have pinned it on a woman, because when you pin it on a woman, what you're really just talking about, as I go back to Rambam's comment, is about sex. And sex was considered not foreign, but a little bit dangerous. Okay, so let's talk about, as we, that's the last text I brought. So what I want to do is to talk about how do we deal with really difficult texts, right? It's very easy to deal with the open texts. Makes us feel good. How do you deal with difficult texts, short of just erasing them from the tradition altogether? Or well, maybe you should. Elaine, do you have a comment? You need to unmute yourself, please. Do you need help unmuting?
Okay, it's not a comment so much as a question, because you said that if the man is talking to his wife, this has to do with his wife only, and it's about the woman should only be absorbed with housekeeping and whatnot. What about discussions of the children? Is there anything joint in that?
So in this Mishnah, to me, again, like I'm going to make this Mishnah the worst version of the Mishnah that can possibly be made, which is that the man doesn't really have those kinds of responsibilities. His responsibilities are to learn Torah, learn a trade, and maybe run the books at home to make sure that bills are paid, right? And that sex is not considered something that he might want to do. Sex is something that he's obligated to do. In fact, in other parts of the Talmud, it talks about, based on what your position was, is how often you had to have sex with your wife, because she's the one who wants sex, not you, right? And I know, I roll my eyes too. So that just making this the worst version of the text you possibly can imagine. So let's just deal with it, okay? One of the important parts, I think, of what makes my version or the conservative version of tradition really powerful is that we're just not willing to delete or throw texts away, as difficult as they are, because to me, they serve as goads. They serve as reminders. They were serve us as reminders that texts were written because of community's expression of the most important and immortal questions that they grapple with in that generation. And what worked for them doesn't obviously work for us. And to our benefit most of the time. They also are a reminder of how far we've come as a society. That as a society, it was in a different world back then. And now we have to ask the question, is that the world we want to build? Do I want to build a 2nd century Mishnaic world, or do I want to build a 21st century American world? And if they were empowered in their lives to build a 2nd century Mishnaic world in Jerusalem or in Tzipori or wherever they were, or in Babylon, then I feel empowered to create a 21st century American Judaism, American Jewish life here in this world. But I'm not willing just to throw those texts out, because without them, I wouldn't know about the direction that we've moved. And I want to know them. I don't want to forget them, so that we can learn about how far we've come. Think about it this way. I'll give you one more way of thinking about it, in my opinion. If we didn't have the Scopes monkey trial, how would we know how far we've come when it comes to civil rights? If we didn't have the Drake trial, if we didn't have the 14th Amendment, how do we get to the 15th Amendment? And I'm not saying ever, and please do not be very clear about what I'm trying to say. I'm not justifying those old texts. But we don't erase the text from the Constitution to say it never existed. We keep it in, we study it, and then we improve on it. And that's how I feel about these texts today. And it doesn't matter if those texts are in the Mishnah or the Talmud or the Midrash. It doesn't matter if the text is in the Torah itself, because they remind us about the progress that we are trying to figure out as a human society over thousands, if not millions of years, how to be more human. And that we hope that we can learn that through our tradition, just as like I hope that God is learning how to be God through our tradition as well. So that's why I say when I say how we deal with difficult texts, I don't erase them. I can strike them through, I can strike them down, I can make them shorter, I can expand them, I can do all sorts of things to try to limit their power, but I don't erase them. And I don't look to them to tell me how to be. I look at them to tell me how we used to be, and like giving us the freedom to create what we need to be. I got time for a couple more questions if anyone has questions or comments. Rabbi Raditsky, I see that you're on the line with us. It's nice to see you here. How would you deal with these texts? Are they just so offensive you'd just throw the whole thing away? Would you forget the first third of the text in order to get rid of the second 2/3 of the text?
You're asking me. I mean, these are certainly difficult texts, but I think a lot of our texts, I mean, they're old. And we're trying to take texts that are written thousands of years ago in a different context, in a different social structure in a community, and relate them to 21st century or our century. Yeah, I guess that is the challenge. I mean,
welcome to the job, Adam.
What's that?
I said, welcome to the job.
It is a difficult text, and it's certainly, I think it's safe to say that there's certain texts that don't apply to our situation, as you said. But we have to find the principles in them, because I would certainly agree that we don't get rid of the text, we don't change it, we evolve with the text and understanding in a new light. So that is a difficult text to deal with. And every time I read it, it's tough. And certainly my wife cringes and just looks at me and says it's not going to happen here. But yeah, it's a tough text.
Thank you. David.
I'm actually comforted by keeping them in because it directly addresses the idea of whether or not we are static or changing. And by if we just made everything go away and made it look like the world had always been like what we imagined things should be in 2020, then it would be profoundly misleading about what happened before, but also it makes it harder for us to consider changing by seeing how others, people who we would like to have great respect for, have their foibles. It should make us consider, well, heck, this was somebody who was one of the writers of the Talmud, and they have their foibles, well, all the more so for us, and that we should be open to the need to change.
Thank you. David, I see your hand, but are there any women who would like to maybe, definitely want to let you ask your question, or you too, Arnie, but if any of the other women want to make a comment or a question, I want to make sure that we hold enough space for you too.
I think they shouldn't dare.
Go ahead.
I ask this question to you every year or so as we're explaining how reasonable we all are and how we should view history as history. But I believe a great many of our co-religionists don't feel that way and take this stuff literally. Now, are we just talking then about our group of wild-eyed liberals, or is this, how do you treat this? We have different laws for different Jews, and maybe we do.
Yes, I think that's the answer. I think that we do have different laws for different Jews. And I actually think that I'm probably a little bit harsher on this than others. I think we have different laws for different cultures of Jews. So it's not just Haredi Jews and us, as you said, wide-eyed liberal Jews have different laws and different cultures. But I think American Jews and Israeli Jews have different cultures with different ideas and different laws. I think that in many ways, East Coast Jews and West Coast Jews, I mean, we live a continent apart. And how we approach Judaism is different. And I'm okay with that, because what Judaism has that Christianity never really reconciled with is that we can all still love each other, even though we have different systems that we can think are true. And that's one of the things that I think is really powerful about Judaism. And I know you ask me this question every year, going on 12 years. So I appreciate the longevity of the question, David. And I think my answers are getting shorter and shorter as we go on. So hopefully, maybe next year I'll be down to one word. Sally.
Yeah, so just, I'm building on what David was talking about, and I'm remembering that the year that Jerry died, my cousin Autumn, who is Black Hat from, came to the house and with great pleasure told my daughters, who were 13 and 15 at the time, that they didn't have to worry that he had hired someone to say Kaddish for their father, because of course girls couldn't do that. And the challenge for me is not so much respecting that there is a diverse Jewish community out there with different beliefs, but what to do when it hits you up close and personal. How to talk about it. I mean, as I recall, my girls were not kind about it. I didn't even have a chance to respond. Yeah. But how to deal with that, with others who feel that what you're saying is basically heresy.
Yeah. So I have a couple of thoughts here. The first is this is where relativism can actually be kind of helpful. The problem with relativism is that it can slide into complete moral relativism, but let's just say relativism for the sake of this conversation. I won't judge you for driving on Shabbat if you don't judge me for waiting 6 hours between meat and milk, for example. And you make your decisions and I make my decisions. The problem when we run into is that when I want to impose my relationship with God on you, and I know that you're like, it's hard that the situation you're talking about is a particularly raw one, because I mean, it was Jerry we're talking about, and then your daughters at the time were young, talking about your particular background we're talking about, Jerry's particular background we're talking about, and then we have your would you say uncle or cousin?
Cousin by marriage, Jerry.
Cousin, so
Cousin-in-law.
cousin by marriage, who feels that he's actually doing you a favor. In his mind, he's doing the most righteous thing, and in your mind, he's doing the most anti-righteous or heinous thing. So like that's where it's really hard. And as a rabbi in that situation, because I have to be who I have to be in that situation, is I would thank him for his thoughtfulness and explain to him that I'm still going to be saying Kaddish for Jerry, because he wasn't trying to be mean. At least it doesn't sound like he was trying to be mean. It sounded like he was trying to fulfill what he felt was his obligation to the covenant. And that's really hard. It's hard to hear that, but I don't know what else advice I would have given you 20 years ago, Sally.
Yeah. Okay,
You know?
no, but that's,
So where this gets really hard is where I think this gets incredibly difficult is when these texts are pushed with political power. That is where this gets really hard. Where if it said this, and then because it said this, there was a law in the state of Israel saying that men aren't allowed to talk to women, especially another man's wife, right? Like if that is where the coercive force of the state is where these conversations become just too difficult, right? Too challenging, because that state-sanctioned version of violence, like that infringes not just on our liberal democratic, and I mean democratic with quotes, rights, but they are a place where pluralism just isn't possible. And that would make the same argument, by the way, about abortion, that a Christian view of abortion shouldn't supersede a state view of abortion. If you don't want to have an abortion, ask your priest. If you want to have an abortion, ask your rabbi. And if you don't like what your rabbi says, go to a different rabbi. But you shouldn't ask your rabbi to change his or her mind. But you should also then have the freedom in a liberal state to do what you feel is right. And that's because the values of the text can inform your spiritual leaders' values, but they shouldn't have the political force of the state. And that's my complicated view of abortion, but I think it applies here too. Okay, Arnie, did you have a question? Did you want to ask your question?
Of a comment. As I read this, it spoke to that folk narrative, not to covet. Well, it was a commandment not to covet your neighbor's property. And here they're describing the wife as, in a different way, as property. They're saying the man,
Yep.
That woman was that other man's property.
Correct.
So it causes us to reflect on that and how far we've come and want, in an important way, how we've evolved.
Right. And there's even was an evolution from the Mishnaic period to the Talmudic period here, specifically around marriage, and then post-Talmudic period as ideas of marriage changed. We had about 1,000 years ago the Takana of a rabbi named Rabbeinu Gershom, who was the most authoritative rabbi during his generation, who said you can't have polygamous marriage anymore, and that women garner extra rights in marriage, and that was supposed to last 1,000 years. I think it finally expired, but I don't think anyone's going back on that. And as things progress and have progressed and accelerated in their change, for the most part, Judaism has adopted those ideas along with it. And I'm not saying all Jews, and I'm not saying all Jews in all places. And I'm not just saying wide-eyed liberal Jews, because you look at conversations happening in the Orthodox community today, specifically with the section of Orthodoxy is called Open Orthodoxy. They're trying to find ways of giving women as much agency as possible. And, my entirely unacademic and imprecise prediction is that in 20 years from now, Orthodoxy or modern Orthodoxy will look like conservative Judaism did 20 years ago. And we will either hold on to that or we will continue this sort of liberalization, egalitarianization of Judaism, and we will become more like Reform Jews, and they will become more like classic or conservative Jews. So, but I don't see that as a bad thing, because that means that there's always going to be a Jewish people, one way or another. Jeff, last comment, because we got to close this up. It's almost 8 o'clock. No, do you have a question?
So, sorry, I was waving at somebody across the room, not you.
Oh, okay, never mind. Marcy, you want to bring it home for us?
Well, I just had a couple of thoughts. Number one, we're talking now BCE, aren't we, or are we?
No, this is around between 1st and 2nd century CE.
Because I thought, I mean, the name was one of the early Zuzot, Nahon?
Yes, although it was, yeah, you're correct in the sense that these early texts could have been, they would not be BCE, they would still be
Early.
right around the year 0, if you believe the lineage to be a literal lineage. And this text, though, was edited, canonized around between the year 150 and 200 CE. So it's an incredibly early text, even for the Mishnah. And you know that from the style of Hebrew, by the way, not just from the name.
So also something comes to mind about when you're talking about women as property, and the evolution of mores and traditions. I'm thinking of the idea of the wife for a night with the Talmudic scholars. There was a whole book written on it, and I'm wondering, is that contemporaneous perhaps with this, or is it later? I mean, how long did we stay in this way of thinking?
We stayed for a very long time. I mean, that's why when I wrote Rambam's comment on the Mishnah was in the 11th century, 800 years after the Mishnah was written. So to answer your question, we were there in that space for a really long time, but we're not anymore. And so,
hallelujah.
I'm not saying we've made it yet either. Let's be clear about that. So let's, instead of looking at the closed part of the text, end with the open part of the text. Dealing with difficult texts is part of who we are, which also means to me that as a community, both Jewish and American, we have to deal and reckon with the things that we're embarrassed by. And if we're willing to do that, and we're willing to square our shoulders and take the hits as we deserve them, then we can open our tent again and try to embody those core values that we find at the opening of this Mishnah, which is to take everyone in and to be as universalistic as possible within reason, but coming from a particular tradition. And that's because we knew our history. We know our history. We know the values and how we've challenged our own values. And as we evolve over time, both to be better Jews and hopefully to make a more perfect union. And with that, I'll say goodnight. Thank you for joining.